It may be 80 years now since millions of Ukrainians died in a famine, but the tragedy remains deeply controversial, the reasons behind it the subject of heated debate. Details of what happened in Ukraine in 1932 and 33 remained buried for years in the archives of the Soviet Union, and they've proved hard to unearth even in these post-Soviet times. John Sweeney, who's been travelling in Ukraine, says the horrors of those days have not been forgotten.
There is something utterly bleak about eastern Ukraine. It eats into the soul. Dirt roads lead to grey wooden shacks that stand out against a dishcloth sky. Our taxi rouses the animals. At the end of rusty chains, dogs growl, geese clack. We're somewhere east of Kharkiv, in the very back of beyond. But around here live the last surviving witnesses to a great lie, one that's still being protected by the powers that be to the east, in the Kremlin. Maria Drabitko was 17 when almost 8 decades ago the starving turned cannibal. Today her face etched with 93 years. She's incredibly frail, bent double, the skin on her face reeved and folded, her hands gnarled, her steps tiny, bird-like. But her voice, when she talks, is firm, and she refutes the great lie with a passionate intensity. To say there was no famine is wrong, she said. There was no bread. People were swollen. Many, many died. Maria told us the story of a woman who lived in the village with her 2 children. Suspicion aroused. A neighbour checked on her, asking what had happened to her kids. To her horror, she noticed there was a hand sticking out of the stove. Asked why she'd eaten her own, the cannibal replied, because they were going to die anyway. Down the dirt road from Maria lived an old man and his wife. He told the story how as a young boy he was revolted to discover that his beloved granny had killed the family cat. He vowed not to eat it, but his granny insisted, and besides the hunger was remorseless, so he ate Kitty. Even today he seemed a little bit ashamed of this story. A third witness, an old lady whose father had died of hunger. She too used the same word, swollen, pointing up the counterintuitive fact that the bellies of the very hungry swell, proof of gross malnutrition. We took the train back to Kharkiv and met an old policeman who, as a very small boy, witnessed thousands queuing for bread and saw with his own eyes many, many corpses lying on the streets. Later, when he applied for a place at military college, he had to fill in a form about the death of his father. He wrote down the truth, that his father had died in the famine. He was advised, don't mention that. 79 years ago, all of these witnesses would have been shot for talking to me about the Holodomor, the death famine. Back in 1933, eastern Ukraine was the epicenter of a terrible man-made famine caused by Stalin's mad war against the peasantry of Russia and Ukraine. Millions died. Nobody knows exactly how many millions because Stalin's secret police killed the truth. Useful idiots like George Bernard Shaw visited the Soviet Union, licked Stalin's boots and went along with the big lie that there was no famine. Journalists in Moscow were banned from the epicenter of the famine zone. But 2 reporters tried to get the truth out. One was Malcolm Muggeridge of the then Manchester Guardian, who managed to get to famine-stricken areas before the ban. The second was Gareth Jones, a Welshman and brilliant Russian speaker, who dodged the secret police by hopping on and off local trains. He walked through the famine zone, through empty villages like Maria's, and got back to the West and told the story. Enter Walter Duranty of the New York Times. A Liverpudlian, clever, witty, Duranty was a man with a crooked soul. Back in Paris before the First World War, he'd been associated with Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist known as the Great Beast. In Moscow in 1933, Duranty pooh-poohed Jones's scoop. He reported there was malnutrition, but no famine. A few months later, Duranty told a diplomat at the British Embassy in Moscow that perhaps as many as 10 million people had died. But he added, they're only Russians. 2 years after Jones's great scoop, he was murdered in China. Later it came out that the company arranging his travel was a front for the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Today, the man with the key to the secret police archive is Vladimir Putin, the once, and some say, future president of Russia. Under Putin, some of the truth about the famine is still being withheld. Maria and the other witnesses won't live much longer. But I hope that they will live long enough for the archives to be unlocked, for the full story to be told, and that includes naming those who ordered the killing of a lone reporter who dared to defy Stalin's will all those years ago. They're only Russians? That was an evil thing to say back in 1933, and it still is today.